An idea, a suggestion leading to a course of action. The starting point of every project. Sprinkle in some will, a pile of wood, and a little experience, and an idea can transform from concept to reality. So stick around and watch how I transform this lumber into an $8,000 table. As I get started unloading the slab, let me tell you a little bit about this project. My clients presented me with a unique challenge. Their idea was a live edge dining table with a really simple base. They didn't want anything to kick or bang into underneath. So, since I've never made a dining table, nor have I done a live edge project of this magnitude, I figured this'll be easy. And that's when I got my first dose of reality as I learned about the weight of wood. Walnut weighs 3.3 pounds per board foot, and at 120 board feet, this slab approached 400 pounds, or, for my metric friends, 180 kilos. And speaking of problems, here's one. That black spot there, that is a big old nail. And really, finding a nail in this tree isn't a surprise, given it lived its life frolicking on a farm in Oregon City. One thing you may not know about black walnut is it's a fantastic shade tree and often planted in parks and people's yards, and whenever people live near trees, they tend to fasten things into them. Not that I would ever do something like that. With the metal end removed and roughly 70 pounds knocked off, it was time to load back up and head over to meet Nick, the owner of Maverick Sawmill, where he has this giant CNC, but where their router would normally be, there's a 12-inch helical cutter head, and in 1 hour and $200 later, he had the slab flattened on both sides. And while outsourcing really wasn't my first choice, it did end up saving me roughly 72 hours of router sledding. And while I do love my router, that sounded like a lot of work, and I'd rather spend that time on a more fun part of the project. Speaking of fun, this is not a fun part of the project, bark removal, but I do have a tip for you. I found a combination of sanding and then chiseling off the low spots with a gouge to be the fastest way to do it. And these nylon wire wheels are horrible, so don't buy them. Now let's take a moment to appreciate the natural figure of this wood. Flattening the slab has revealed all the little areas that need to be filled. On the smaller cracks, I prefer to use a fast option, which is simply shoving some wood glue into the cracks, then sanding over the top to force some dust down in. After half an hour, once the glue is set up, I fill the remaining void with black CA. For anything larger like this knot, I like to use tabletop epoxy because it's a little thicker and it'll stay put even when just over the surface of the wood, so you don't have to make a hot glue dam to hold it in place. And while we wait for that epoxy to cure, it's time to move on to the base. So you know how you see woodworkers go back and forth slowly cutting through a board at the miter saw? Well, here's why. See how with each cut the board slowly relaxes down until the final cut drops it to the table? If you tried to cut this board all the way through at once, it would have kicked back, and you definitely don't want that. I didn't catch that this board had some buggy wood, and I wouldn't call it a mistake, but something I needed to roll with to best use the material that I have. And what I decided to do was change my design and add a cool feature to the legs by tapering them, which removed the issue and actually made the base look a little bit sleeker overall. And I wouldn't have thought of it had these bugs not bitten into this board, so what I'm really saying is, thank you. Thank you, bugs. Typically, a table is supported with stretchers and an entire substructure underneath the tabletop, but this is designed with two separate trapezoidal bases that are connected directly to the slab, which means each one needs to be strong on its own. Hence, some through mortise and tenons to connect the legs to the top plate, and you'll see that the joinery choices prioritize strength while still looking pretty darn good. And now what you're seeing me do is use a block of wood to establish the angles of the mortises. I find it easier to have simple setups like this over a complicated jig. Anytime you're adding complexity, everything gets a little bit more finicky. And if I can do something in a very simple way, then that's what I'm going to gravitate towards. Generally, there are two options for fitting tenons into router cup mortises. One, you can square the corners of the mortise, or B, you can round the tenons. In this case, I'm rounding the tenons because I find it easier to cut corners. With the mortise and tenons done, it's time for the final bit of joinery. And I went round and round on this bottom plate joinery, and I really wanted to do dovetails, but I knew this was not the right project for my first dovetail attempt. So I decided for a rabbet, and this rabbet is gonna be reinforced with some hidden screws coming from underneath the bottom plate. This is my favorite part of any project because it marks the transition between phases. I'm moving from construction into the final details. And in this moment, you can see the table starting to take shape, which is a great reason to celebrate. And I don't know exactly what I was listening to at this point, but I got to imagine it sounded something like this. Superb dance moves aside, it's detail time, the first of which is, of course, a bit more joinery. After all, I need a way to connect the base to the slab, and simply bolting it on is not my style. I wanted a tighter and stronger method that would also resist racking, which is why I'm setting up the dado stack to create a rabbet in the top plate. Essentially, it's more mortise and tenon with the top plate going under and into the slab to strengthen the connection while also accounting for wood movement. After all, I'm building this table in the dry season, and based on humidity swings from summer to winter, this 46-inch wide table will become a 47-inch wide table in the winter. And that, along with the elongated mortise and in combination with some slotted bolt holes, will ensure that this slab has enough room to move throughout the seasons. What you're about to see me do is make a big mistake. I was out of double-sided tape, but I had some old carpet tape lying around, and this is going to come back to bite me. While the template popped right off, the carpet tape embedded itself in the walnut, and at this point I was really worried that I had ruined the underside of this table and it would interfere with the finish, but all I could do was dissolve the tape with mineral spirits, scrape it off with a putty knife, and I mentioned this is the final detail phase of the project, and the final details don't always start off in the original design. Some come on a whim as the project unfolds, and in this case I saw the top plate looked a little chunky and I wanted to bevel the ends to make the connection a little more seamless and integrated. I mentioned these earlier, another way to mitigate wood movement, and these are the slotted holes for the bolts. Started with the router, leaving space for the washer, drilled out and smoothed by hand with the chisel, allowing the bolts to slide freely as the slab expands. And now for a sanding tip. When it comes time to sand the edges of narrow boards, stack them together to give the sander a larger surface to sit, making the sander easier to control and prevent tipping, which will gouge the edges. Oh, and pre-sand whenever you can. Sanding after assembly makes getting into those corners a pain. So there, you get 2 sanding tips when I promised 1. And if you felt I've delivered some good tips and content, I sure would appreciate if you subscribed and gave this video a like. But only do so if you're enjoying this video, and while you're down there, leave me a comment about what you liked. While we wait for glue to dry, it's time to address that epoxy from earlier. Epoxy is brittle and tends to chip, especially if you're trying to cut it. But if you apply a little heat, the epoxy will soften and scrape right up. While I could simply sand the epoxy back, I find it easier to scrape, so I do that wherever I can, because that just helps save me a little bit of sanding time, which is always a good thing. Over the course of this project, I've grown an appreciation for the work that goes into these slab tables. It's more than just sanding and smearing on some finish, and the sheer weight is really no joke. This slab is the size and weight of 3 sheets of plywood stacked and glued together, and that's really not the easiest thing to flip and move around, especially when you're by yourself.
All right, one thing you don't know, I bought this slab back in March. It is currently end of July. A lot of things happened in those 4 months, and now it is no longer flat. Wood's gonna move, I know that. I did some checking, and with this long level here, you can definitely see the problem. But when I put this short one on, it disappears completely. So what that tells me is, from edge to edge, we have a problem. In the middle, we're okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and mark out and see exactly where I need to hand plane this to take off some of the material, bring this thing back down to flatter or flat-ish.
The reason I say flat-ish is because it really doesn't matter how flat this table is as long as it's flat enough that your peas and carrots don't roll off your plate. And luckily this slab has moved now, so I can address it before it heads out to my client's house. With that done, it's time for all the final details like cleaning up and sanding the edges and filling holes with CA glue. These holes happen because air bubbles get trapped under the surface of the epoxy, and by using an awl to make the holes a little bit bigger, the super glue has some space to sink down in. Then with a little accelerator spray over the top, it instantly cures, and a little sanding makes those holes completely disappear. While I remove tear out with a card scraper, I want to talk about these minute details, which are arguably the most important part of a project. This is when I shift my mindset from maker to owner, and I think through those little things, like how resting your feet on a sharp edge wouldn't be comfortable, but a chamfer on the bottom plate lets the person sitting at the table focus on the beauty of the piece, not the pain in their feet. And with that, let's finish this one up. We're not always lucky enough to see it happen. But take an idea, some lumber, and a whole lot of action, and a transformation can happen before our eyes.